We all started debating because we thought it was a enjoyable activity, an activity that gave us an enormous amount of benefits, and one that kept giving us so much more when we continued. But for some people, staying active in debating isn't always easy. There are people who have some difficulties with their mental health whilst they're debating. And the community by and large is very helpful at addressing it, but can always do better. That is why Jessica Musulin, together with other people, addressed some of the pressing concerns surrounding mental health in debating, to try and make it a truly inclusive space for all. They wrote a document that received a large amount of attention within the debating Facebook pages, and she's here today to talk about the idea she has about making sure that debating keeps it to be a welcoming space for all. On top of the note which they wrote, and the process where they gave us anonymous information where people could share their troubles surrounding mental health, they are also trying to make debating a community that allows a little bit of brevity or to share stories about the person behind the debater. That's why, and this was secret at the time of recording, but I'm happy to announce this up front in the introduction, they organized also community spaces like debating pop posting, where people could talk about popular culture, or they talk about humans of debating, where people are able to share their story, so we get to know people from far more perspectives. All of this truly can make debating a more welcoming and inclusive community, and I'm very happy to have such a thoughtful person on the program today. Jessica Musulin, thank you very much for joining us.
Hi, happy to be here.
Great. Shall we dive straight into it? So you've written this note on mental health in debating, which I think was full of very sensible and helpful advice and a way forward. But to start with, could you detail what mental health means in the context of this note? So what does it encompass? What do you envision people need to think about when they think about trying to improve their own mental health?
Yeah, so I guess myself and the other authors wrote this to be quite broad and all-encompassing, including but not limited to people experiencing in debating stress, depression, eating issues. It is quite broad, and I guess some of the stories that people have followed up with, are also quite broad. So maybe I don't know still if mental health is the best descriptor. Perhaps well-being is another way to kind of look at it. But the intention was to kind of tell a broad story about some of the issues people face in debating, whether it be stress or issues around depression, or just dealing with some of the unfortunately more toxic cultures that exist in debating. We've tried to be as clear as possible in the article that we're not purporting to be experts on this. It's just from our own experience. There's certainly a wide array of other issues ranging from disability to neurodivergency that kind of may fall under the banner of this, and people should obviously speak to their own experiences about that, but we're not purporting to do that. So yeah.
Yeah, I think that's very sensible. I mean, I'm thinking back about my own time in debating, and I've both noticed barriers due to something that I was diagnosed under the DSM-4 for, which is autism, but also general feelings of anxiety, which I definitely don't think you can link back to that autism, but both did affect me meaningful. So I think it's a very sensible approach to try and say these are broad things and broad symptoms that can play out, and we don't require an official categorization or a diagnosis in order for you to deserve both help and support from the community.
Exactly right. Yeah.
So why did the four of you feel compelled to speak out about this issue?
So to be honest, it just started off, I sort of was reflecting on how I was feeling a bit down and depressed for a number of weeks. And obviously there's a personal element to that, but I kind of reflected on that. Some of that was owing to some aspects of debating, and initially just started writing out how I was feeling as a bit of catharsis, but then kind of thought that I really would like to do something to, hopefully relate to some people and do something positive with it. I so reached out to the other authors, Enting, Lucia and Jeremiah, and asked if they sort of would like to be involved with this sort of project, because I didn't want to post something by myself. And luckily they were on board and kind of had similar views to me around some of the problems in debating, and I guess some of the things we might be able to do to ever so marginally perhaps fix them. And they were obviously also, I'm very grateful to them, for sharing their personal stories as well. So kind of evolved that way. And yeah, very grateful to have all of them involved with the piece. So I think it was a bit for ourselves as much as, it was to, obviously we hope that it does some good at the same time.
Yeah, I think it's very important to notice that all four of you, of course, also detail your own personal experiences, and I think in that sense, I think the community can be very grateful for the fact that your catharsis at least led to an opening up of this conversation. Now, you highlight quite a large amount of problems that do exist in debating and are potentially even unique to debating or how it manifests itself. So you're talking in a note about debating being an intellectual activity, and then it appears to judge someone's intellectual capabilities, which of course feels very bad if then you get the fourth in a round where that's something to mean about how clever you are. You mentioned the fact that biases exist, both on an ethnic or a sexual or a gender level, that social circles are often built around how well someone does in a competition. So that's quite a large amount of things that we need to be very careful about within debating. Could you detail to me the extent to which you think this may affect individuals, and how common do you think this problem is within the community?
Well, I guess, I mean, that's a tricky one to answer, but I think my observation is that what's sort of unique about debating is that, there are certainly other hobbies and extracurricular activities that have some of those attributes, like sport is competitive. Other hobbies have social hierarchies, but it seems to me that debating kind of has all of those intersect with one another, which can make it really tricky. Just my sort of anecdotal observation is that they're a lot more common than people think. And if anything, I was, surprised to see a lot of the stories that we got following the article. People who I never would have expected would have felt the same. So it probably goes to show it is more common. And I guess the other observation I would just make is that maybe not everyone intersects with every aspect. So someone might, for example, be on top of the social hierarchy, but they might still face bias in other ways, or, vice versa. So I think my feeling was that there's at least, probably everyone at least relates to one, or several aspects of the things that we point to. And I guess the feedback that we got suggests that it is a lot of people were feeling that way. And indeed, a lot of people that I wouldn't have guessed also felt that way. And I guess that was part of my thought for sharing my view, is that I think maybe some people might look at me and think that I'm confident and always happy. And, in some part, that's a bit of a facade, and I don't always feel like that. So I kind of just wanted people to know that if anything, so their interactions with me could be more honest.
Yeah, and I think it's very important to mention here that, of course, how common a problem is doesn't necessarily mean that that increases the chances that we need to do something about it. But the fact that you're pointing out that you have, to some extent, a masculine behavior, for that you're confident, sometimes masculine insecurity. Similarly, I've definitely made sure that me coming across as authoritative about issues can hide the fact that I'm deeply uncertain about certain things. I think it's very important to show that because that is quite common, it means that you might want to change your approach how to talk with people, because it therefore becomes more likely that people indeed are putting up to some extent a facade. So I think that's an incredibly important observation that you're making here. So thank you. Now, obviously, not everyone might agree or experience the worldview as set out in this note. So a viewpoint that has, I think, in discussions surrounding debating over the past decade or so, has often come back is the idea that if you feel this anxious, then that is your own problem and you need to deal with it yourself. And that if debating makes you uncomfortable, that means that it's not something that the rest of the debating community needs to really take care of, because that's not their fault. One of the most devious versions of that is, if you can't stay the heat, stay out of the kitchen. Where do you think the mistake is in that thinking?
I mean, look, I agree that debating is, an inherently competitive activity, and there's, and social circles, and they're all inevitable, and there's, probably very little we can do. Again, part of that is part of the activity, and, or in a way, what makes the activity good. We all want to reach a certain level, but I think the mistake in that thinking is just that, that doesn't mean we can't make it, as inclusive or as, by sort of emphasizing other parts of, what can make debating good. So yes, let's work hard and try to reach, aspects of success, but at the same time, not overemphasizing those, things to the exclusion of, just enjoying people's company in the circuit or anything like that. And, we can still obviously have, you strive for that competitive activity, but still try to support people along the way. And I think that is important for one, just because I think that's the sort of most moral and fair thing to do. But two, I think if you are striving for a competitive circuit, if you're isolating really talented people who would otherwise, not stick around, but for that culture, then you're potentially losing some really, it's probably a less important reason, but you're potentially losing some really good debaters as well. And I know a lot of people that was, so talented, but haven't stuck around because for whatever reason they've just struggled to deal with, so that's a shame. So that's kind of what I would, my take there would be.
Yeah, and in some ways, this echoes a conversation that we're having within IDEA, where we built a training program. Where one of the key pedagogical components was that we should try to have more positive feedback within the debating community, because it often feels then that people say, "But I want to learn. Tell me all your mistakes." Because that's how I got better. It feels like some sort of survivor bias. Whereas if we would have a more progressive and constructive form of feedback, it quite likely means that still a lot of people would improve, but also the community as a whole would be much more welcoming to individuals and feel less scary. So in that sense, I think your comment does here very well, for me at least, is that it enables me to think there are, of course, ways in which we can counteract the structural issues, as you point out, and make sure that at least we don't indulge in those to the further extent. That's very good.
And like, I think just a very small example of that is when I give feedback now, I try really hard to have obviously things people can do to improve, but tell them what they did that was good. It sounds so deceptively obvious, but I hope that sort of helps people.
So your piece mentions a lot of very sensible advice to individuals then as well, of course. Although that advice might sometimes be very hard to follow when you're currently experiencing stress or anxiety. So what are ways that you can think of that help lower the threshold for following this advice, for desiring, for instance, to opt out of a tournament that's better for you, even though this is currently the biggest thing that we do in Zoom world to see our friends, or we have an ambitious partner who's edging us on to do this prep competition because they want to do really well at Worlds?
Yeah. Well, it's sort of very funny you asking that, because I, despite putting that in the article, I'm probably the person that follows that advice the least. I've been known to both debate in and CA like different competitions on the same weekend across multiple time zones and just completely wreck my body in the process. And that is for the, I'll just be honest, the very, the reason that I found that if I am not like constantly doing things, my brain has too much time to think. And then sometimes I have some honestly fairly destructive thoughts. So I keep myself constantly busy to avoid that. So like I can relate more than anyone to the idea that like it's well and good to say take a break from debating, like give yourself, I don't even do that. So if I had all the answers, I guess I wouldn't be writing the article in the first place, But I think in theory, the answer to that is it doesn't have to be all or nothing. I took one weekend off, probably should take more weekends off, but it's better than nothing. And I think if people can just try to readjust their expectations a little bit, that's probably the best thing. So don't, or if you're still doing the same amount of tournaments, just make sure you're like eating, or again, as much as possible and well hydrated, and just not see everything as like a, this all or nothing approach, I think is probably the best thing I could say to people. And I try to remind myself that as much as possible, although sometimes different in theory and practice. So I think that would be my main takeaway.
And nonetheless, a very important one, because as you point out, if it is difficult to follow this advice, and I think a great many of us can attest to that, at the very least, having the opportunity to say, this is something that I would want to do more, and being open about it, I think very helpful, because that means that other people can maybe hold you to their promise or check in with you, see if everything is okay, even if you are at that competition. to make sure that things go better. So I think that that's indeed a very sensible set of advices to follow, and that there is that caveat that if you do make that quote unquote mistake, that you then at least make the best of it.
Yeah.
Now, of course, there's something that you can do as an individual, but there are also things that a community can take up on more broadly. So one of the examples that you mentioned in the piece is the Auckland Rumble, which was a tournament that took very great care to build a more inclusive tournament model. It offered multiple break opportunities for people. It gave people the opportunity to speak with people who were more experienced and therefore had more support. It didn't release a full speaker tab, so people could needlessly compare oneself to another or fight over the iota of speaker point difference they had with their friend. Do you think that the community should strive to make a model like this the norm going forward for competitions?
Look, I don't necessarily think it needs to be the norm. I think the main thing is that there is variety and that there is different opportunities for people to access. And I think, especially if this can be emphasized as perhaps more the norm for development tournaments, if not, fair enough, maybe not open competitions is, people still want tabs and fine. But I think it's just about giving people different options. So if you are a speaker that just cannot enjoy that sort of environment, then at least you've got some different tournaments at your disposal. And particularly, I think emphasizing these sort of things as a model for development type tournaments, I think is really important. So I understand why that approach doesn't work everywhere and that people still want the more, ultra competitive things. But I think if it's just about giving people choice and thinking about how people might enter competitive debating, they're probably going to be more likely to enjoy a full-on experience later if their first entry into it was a little bit kinder, perhaps.
Do you think this is similar to, for instance, some arguments in favor of running women's or LGBT plus competitions, that it offers a alternative model for getting better at it and building out the confidence necessary to compete in the full brutal version of the competitions?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, for me, women's competitions have been very helpful for me for that reason, just to feel like, I'm taken seriously as a speaker. I can have the kind of relief of going through a tournament, not having to constantly worry about if I'm going to be penalized for saying too much, So definitely, I think the same sort of feeling there.
Yeah, and another institutional change that you've mentioned is that there's, of course, a need to look critically at the equity officer system. Now, the equity officer system, I think, at least in my time in debating, was quite a controversial institution, not necessarily for the things it did to try and alleviate mental health concerns, but also because it was seen to be some sort of arbiter in free speech issues. It was often seen as this omen in a culture war, where if an equity officer wanted to protect someone's mental health, it did so at the expense of someone else's right to say what they wanted. So maybe it's helpful here to articulate what it actually is that an equity officer does currently, and how then does this relate to the need of professionalization that you identify in the note?
Yeah. I think that is tricky for the reason that my experience is that the role of the equity officer varies so much across circuits. And now I've had and I'm I guess speaking to my experience having done equity roles in Australia, in Asia, and also online tournaments now. And it varies a lot. And online it's largely, I think, reminding people of conduct. There's obviously less usually capacity for equity issues given people are not interacting in person. In Australia, I think unfortunately sometimes it becomes being a bit of a babysitter for drunk novices, which is unfortunate. Probably shouldn't be that. And it does occasionally delve into those really tricky issues, arbitering, being an arbiter of some very sensitive, and there's no easy answer in that. But in my mind, the need for consideration of reform, even if it's not wholesale, but even piecemeal, is twofold. One is that it is a burden on equity officers themselves often to deal with the range of issues that can come up. And also, if they are largely being expected to deal with the well-being of tournament participants, particularly in-person tournaments, that can, have a huge range of issues insofar as, 20-something-year-olds are probably not equipped to look after the well-being of, hundreds of students. So I think there's already been a lot of discussions, I think, in forums like Debate Serious posting about potential reforms to the system. I don't have a view on exactly what that might look like, but I think discussions around professionalisation are important. But if anything, if that's not possible, I think there are small things that we can do to just lend support to that system, like, for example, making sure equity teams are big enough. It seems super obvious, but don't have 2 people on an equity team. Spread the load around, try to make those teams as diverse as possible. So yeah, I think there are some larger things we can think about, but in the meantime, definitely just making sure that those teams are supported, they have what they need, there's enough of them, those sorts of things is, in my mind, both good for them, but also participants.
I think that's definitely, and once again, very helpful. But also, one thing that I think is a common thread in this topic, starting with the first question onwards, is that there's so many different things that encompass this idea of mental health or mental well-being. And I did, as you point out, if an equity officer both needs to deal with in-debate conduct, with someone going through a depressive period for whatever reason, and people who are incredibly drunk and need to be babysat, that is a wide spectrum of things, and also requires, I think, a wide spectrum of skills in order to be able to navigate that. So it does sound very sensible that at the very least we do things like either go the way of personalization or have equity teams where different people have different roles. I think that's all indeed very important. And I'm indeed thinking back of my time, equity in Euros, and the when I spoke about equity officer being seen as this role of being like this free speech harbinger, we spent very little to no time on that at all. We spent most of the time dealing with people who were in genuine crises or for whatever reason, and needing to deal with that alongside some painful behind the room negotiation. So I think it's very important that you're highlighting that there's this need to make sure that if we are so concerned about mental health, that we do think critically about the institutional support structures going forward. Now, moving back to the personal stories you told, and I think you've already highlighted that they've received a large amount of response. One of the things that I find particularly important is that the 4 of you at least are within the debate community for a while. You've have amassed a certain form of reputation for being good at the activity and being very helpful in the activity and setting up good tournaments. Do you feel that this was helpful in making sure also we play into the problem we have between mental health and reputation, where you've identified that we often have this feeling of social hierarchies that are exclusory? And do you think that opening up and showcasing that people at the quote unquote top are more vulnerable in that sense was also a useful thing to do?
Well, look, I hope so. I mean, I'll be honest, one of my big worries before publishing this was I didn't want to in any way suggest that you needed to have debate achievements to be able to talk about this, or that, yeah, it was okay for us, but like other people ought not feel the same. Like that was, it was a big worry I had. Thankfully sort of addressed though by the fact that when we did eventually posted it, at least, and I hope this is correct, I can only gauge what, I saw, but just based on who commented, who messaged me, it did seem like it did resonate with people kind of across various parts of the community. For some it was about feeling that, they could, now had a bit of coverage, I suppose, to post their feelings and their story, or at least just feel, at least what they were feeling was, relatable, even if they weren't, in a position to share what they were feeling themselves. So just, yeah, based on what the feedback was, it seems to have helped, but it was a big worry of mine that it might create some sort of perception that, oh, like we can do this because we've brokered a few things, but that wasn't the intention, obviously. And I think, but yeah, it needs, I think, be constantly part of the discussion, which is just like, one, yeah, just because someone might have a CV, that doesn't mean they don't also feel insecure. But 2, we have to be particularly mindful that debating does often have social hierarchies that are based around things like CV and it's so important to be inclusive. And, I try to practice that as much as I can. When I'm at a tournament, I really try to talk to everyone, but I can appreciate, circles tend to just build somewhat naturally. If you're in a certain room debating, you're going to talk to people in that room, so we just, I think, have to be continually mindful of that.
Yeah, and I think one of the ways in which you, I think, not just say, but also show that you want this conversation to be open is the fact that you've all created this way in which people can share their mental health stories anonymously through the survey. And it received an enormous amount of feedback. And I've seen enormous amount of posts now being shared on the Debating Facebook. What of these stories has stayed with you for now? And why do you think this has been such a good thing that's received so much response?
I think it goes back to like the sheer sort of volume of it. I think it just, again, really, like, again, I was so worried about posting something and people being like, what are you talking about? Like, and just, it was, I guess, a bit of it sounds horrible because I don't want other people to feel bad. Like, I'd be happier knowing that other people were happy, but in a way it was a bit of a relief to feel that what I was feeling, other people felt as well, and that it's just, something that we're, I guess, all in together. I guess, like, for me, I guess the really valuable part of it was like learning about aspects of navigating mental health that I wasn't aware of before. So, for example, some debaters spoke about how it's very difficult to navigate debating whilst having ADHD. And I had never kind of contemplated that perspective before. So that was really valuable for me. And I guess I also found it interesting that like, we had some comments shared with us that just in the form that people, despite being anonymous, didn't even want to post themselves, which I think also just demonstrated that it's not even just about sharing your story. Sometimes just people want to talk and they want that catharsis. So I think going back to the recommendations, some of them are straightforward and it's about putting them into practice, and it's like about, they seem obvious, but it's just that we're not doing them. Other things are more complicated. I think at the core, even if we don't do any of that, I think it's just about being more open in the way that we discuss these issues is probably like the key takeaway. So that's, I guess, sort of what stuck with me the most.
And of course, this is a conversation that is, I think, particularly consigned to the university debating sphere, because that's where Debating Facebook operates. But do you think that there are any suggestions that you've written down that would also be particularly helpful on the high school level?
Yeah, well, it's interesting. I've actually noticed that more and more high schoolers are kind of on those types of groups. So hopefully some of that is sort of filtering down. I think all of it does kind of apply as equally to high school as it does to university. Like, it would be silly to think social hierarchies don't exist in those circles. And also, the ways in which people attribute parts of their, sense of self manifests the same. I think if anything, the article and particularly some of the comments that were made showed that a lot of people commented things like, going through this high school environment was particularly stressful for them. They talked about things like having coaches that were, excessively demanding or maybe didn't treat them as well as they could. So I think it's just that usual reminder that ought to just be obvious, that like, kids are kids, and boy, we have to look after them. Like, we have to have the highest standards for coaches, and because you're looking after not only the debating performance, but the mental well-being of, a bunch of teenagers. But I also think some of the recommendations obviously can apply to, school kids. Like, for example, like, unfortunately, I don't know what the norm is in a lot of circuits, but, it would seem to me like if you're running high school tournaments, like, don't publish a tab, like, things like that, I think stand out to me more so for some of those groups. So I think that, and just the kind of usual reminders, and being particularly conscious of the obligation and responsibility we have to those kids, particularly if we're coaching them or looking after those sorts of programs.
Yeah, I think that's also indeed very important, especially things about the tab. One of the things that I'm reminded of if I look back at my own circuit is that For the longest while, the Dutch high school circuit didn't really have a strong pool of judges. In order to protect those judges, of course, all of them adults, they sort of made it that they should give as least and as unspecific of feedback as possible, which of course is tremendously dissatisfying for the students involved, and really felt like a moment where we were protecting the adults at the expense of the children. And I think those are the type of practices that we'd really need to look into, especially because some of the things you write down in this document, I think, might be exaggerated on a school level, because indeed the desire to be within, say, the in-group, the fact that you might feel anxious and more uncertain about your own performance is often exaggerated when you're a bit younger.
Yeah, for sure.
So what then do you think that the next steps are that the community needs to take? Obviously not something you necessarily have to do yourself. And I think we often problematize thinking that it are individuals that need to take the steps. So rather for the community as a whole, what do you hope is next?
And that's really hard, right? I think, we've said at the end of the article, contemplate what we've said, have discussions in your circuits, in your institutions, and so on. And I think a lot of what needs to happen is at that kind of circuit or institutional level. And there's only so much we can do as like a global community. So I think a lot of it rests on, societies to make sure that they've got, executive positions that can kind of look after those things, or resources that they can direct people to. In my mind, I'm kind of thinking, what is next? I kind of wanted the piece to sit for a little bit and people digest it and, have that kind of conversation in their minds about what it is, how they interact with it. Potentially in a few months, I might do a follow-up of some sort, to kind of see what people have, made of it, what people have, if they can point to any other things that we ought to be doing, whether they've seen any good changes, since then. But it is tricky. Though I am working on a little, with a couple others, a side project that sort of builds on the article. Not able to say what it is just yet, but I'll be sure to send you the details once it is a bit more developed. So I think it's just, but like at the end of the day, I think we put a series of recommendations in there, and I think, again, they're useful, but I think the core of all of this is just talking about it more. So if nothing else changes, but we talk about it more, I hope that is still some sort of positive trajectory benefit. So
yeah,
it is,
and I just think indeed that we do need to talk about it more, which I think is very helpful. I would hope then that this is something that can go beyond the fact that a couple of individuals pick it up and do institutionalize it. Because as you point out, it's never over insofar as there might always be new things. And I think some of these things are embedded within the activity. So having this be discussed regularly, perhaps training on a club or a tournament level, having the opportunity for people to anonymously share stories, and not necessarily having one individual who, for as long as they stay in the circuit, they can keep sharing that on the social media, but maybe having a more embedded structure. All sounds like, I think, very good things, because so many times we often think that we need to find a fix for things, rather than believing that this is just inherently a part of a thing that we need to continuously strive towards. It's not as if we're trying to say equity officers need to be abolished at one point. And so we're just trying to get a fix that, but rather they now are a institutionalized thing that helps us move through the problems that inevitably arise at competitions. So that, I think, is a very good suggestion to keep in mind as well. Thank you.
And I will say, I think one of, again, our worries publishing something like this was we didn't want there to be a conversation and then people pat themselves on the back and say, okay, good chat, and then go exactly back to how things were, or like thinking things were solved. As you said, it needs to be a continuous kind of conversation. There's no easy fix. It is something sort of inherent to the activity that we just need to be constantly mindful of, I think.
Having said that, I would like to thank you for being part of the conversation right now. And this also means that I promise that if a new development arises, for instance, if you have that new plan that you're working on, we'd love to have you back so we can keep having that conversation and not believe that it's fixed by the end of this episode.
Awesome. Thanks for having me.
Thank you.